I was standing in my garage in Scottsdale, Arizona, staring at the fluorescent orange violation notice taped to my front door, when I realized my peaceful retirement was about to become a living nightmare. The notice stated that I had 72 hours to remove unauthorized heating equipment visible through garage windows or face daily fines of $200. I read it 3 times, my arthritic fingers cramping as I held the paper. Unauthorized heating equipment. I looked back at my garage where my car was parked, and there on the floor sat my heated floor mats. The same medical-grade heated mats my rheumatologist had prescribed 6 months ago when my arthritis had gotten so bad I could barely stand for more than 15 minutes without excruciating pain. My name is Xavier Irons, and I had moved to the Desert Valley Estates community thinking the dry Arizona heat would help my condition. I was 58 years old, a retired mechanical engineer who had spent 30 years designing HVAC systems for commercial buildings. The irony was not lost on me that someone who had dedicated his career to keeping people comfortable was now struggling with his own physical comfort. My ex-wife had gotten the house in Denver during the divorce 2 years ago, and I had used my half to buy this modest 3-bedroom ranch house in what I thought would be a quiet, peaceful community. The Desert Valley Estates HOA had seemed reasonable during my initial walk through. The neighborhood was clean, the houses well maintained, and the monthly fees were not unreasonable at $150. What I had not anticipated was that the HOA board president, a woman named Patricia Vanderbilt, would become the bane of my existence. I crumpled the notice and walked back into my garage. The heated floor mats were not even plugged in at the moment. They were simply sitting on the concrete floor near my workbench. I used them when I worked on small projects, standing on them to keep my joints warm and reduce the inflammation that made even simple tasks agonizing. My rheumatologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been explicit about their importance. Without them, I would need to increase my pain medication, which already made me feel foggy and disconnected. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management office. A bored-sounding receptionist answered on the 4th ring. Desert Valley Estates HOA, this is Monica speaking. Hi Monica, this is Xavier Irons from 4782 Seguero Lane. I just received a violation notice about heating equipment, but I think there has been a mistake. Hold please. The line went silent for nearly 5 minutes before a different voice came on. This one was sharp, nasal, and dripping with self-importance. Mr. Irons, this is Patricia Vanderbilt, HOA president. I assume you are calling about your violation. Yes, Mrs. Vanderbilt. The notice mentions heating equipment, but those are medical floor mats prescribed by my doctor for arthritis. They are not unauthorized equipment. I saw them myself during my neighborhood inspection yesterday, Patricia said, her voice taking on that particular tone that only HOA board presidents and middle school principals seem to master. Those orange and black mats are clearly visible through your garage window. They are unsightly and violate Section 12.4 of our community guidelines regarding visible storage of inappropriate items. They are medical equipment, I repeated, trying to keep my voice calm. I have documentation from my doctor. That may be, but they need to be stored out of sight. The community guidelines are very clear. We have standards to maintain, Mr. Irons. Property values do not maintain themselves. They are on the floor of my garage. How much more out of sight can they be? They can be seen from the street if someone looks through your garage window at the correct angle. I saw them myself. You have 72 hours to remove them from view or the fines begin. Good day, Mr. Irons. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, feeling that familiar combination of frustration and disbelief that seems to be the hallmark of HOA interactions everywhere. I had dealt with difficult clients and unreasonable managers throughout my career, but this was different. This was my home, and someone was telling me I could not use prescribed medical equipment because it was unsightly. That evening, I sat in my living room with my laptop and actually read through the entire Desert Valley Estates HOA guidelines document. It was 87 pages long, written in the kind of bureaucratic language that makes tax code read like poetry. Section 12.4 did indeed discuss visible storage, but was vague enough to be interpreted a dozen different ways. It mentioned holiday decorations, recreational equipment, and work materials, but said nothing specific about medical equipment. I drafted an email to Patricia Vanderbilt, carefully explaining the situation. I attached a letter from Dr. Chen explaining my condition and the medical necessity of the heated mats. I explained that the mats were an essential part of managing a chronic pain condition, and that removing them would significantly impact my quality of life and ability to function in my own home. I kept my tone professional and respectful, hoping that a simple misunderstanding could be cleared up with documentation and clear communication. Patricia responded within an hour. Her email was 3 sentences long. Mr. Irons, medical documentation does not supersede community guidelines. All residents must comply with the same standards. Your violation stands. Regards, Patricia Vanderbilt, HOA President. I read those 3 sentences until my vision blurred. She had not even acknowledged the medical aspect. She had not asked for more information or suggested a compromise. She had simply dismissed everything I had said and doubled down on her position. The next morning, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. According to the community website, meetings were held on the first Wednesday of each month at the community center near the main entrance. That was 5 days away, which left me with 2 days after the meeting before my supposed violation deadline expired. I figured I could make my case in person, show the board my medical documentation, and resolve this situation like reasonable adults. I spent those 5 days doing research. I looked up Arizona HOA laws, disability rights, and fair housing regulations. I discovered that the Fair Housing Act actually required HOAs to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. Arthritis, particularly the severe degenerative arthritis I had been diagnosed with, qualified as a disability under federal law. This meant that Patricia Vanderbilt and her board were potentially violating federal law by refusing to accommodate my medical needs. Armed with this information and a folder full of documentation, I arrived at the Desert Valley Estates Community Center at 6:30 on Wednesday evening. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock, and I wanted to be early. The community center was a modest stucco building painted in the ubiquitous beige that seemed to be the official color of Arizona architecture. Inside, a large meeting room had been set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board members would sit. I was the only person there besides an elderly woman who was arranging papers at the board table. She looked up as I entered and gave me a polite smile. "Good evening, are you here for the meeting?" "Yes, I am. Xavier Irons. I need to address a violation notice I received." Her smile dimmed slightly. "Oh, you will need to wait until the open comment period at the end of the meeting. I am Dorothy Winters, board secretary." "That is fine, thank you." I took a seat in the 3rd row and waited. Over the next 20 minutes, a handful of other residents trickled in. Most were older, probably retirees like myself. A few looked like younger professionals, likely attending to address their own HOA issues. By 7 o'clock, there were maybe 15 people in the room. Patricia Vanderbilt entered at 7:05 like a queen arriving at court. She was probably in her mid-50s, with severely cut blonde hair that looked professionally styled and sprayed into submission. She wore a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, pearl earrings, and carried a leather-bound planner that she set on the table with deliberate precision. She was followed by 3 other board members: a balding man in his 60s who turned out to be the treasurer, a younger woman who seemed nervous and kept checking her phone, and an older gentleman who immediately looked half asleep. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia began, not bothering with a microphone despite the room's poor acoustics. "I call this meeting of the Desert Valley Estates Homeowners Association to order. Dorothy, please confirm we have a quorum." The meeting proceeded with all the excitement of watching paint dry. They discussed the budget for landscape maintenance, debated the color scheme for repainting the community center, and spent 20 minutes arguing about whether to allow a resident to install a new mailbox that was 3 inches taller than the approved standard. Through it all, Patricia ran the meeting with an iron fist, cutting off discussion when she deemed it had gone on too long and dismissing concerns with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that would make a DMV clerk proud. Finally, after nearly 90 minutes, Patricia announced the open comment period. "We will now hear from residents who have concerns or questions. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less." I stood up, folder in hand, and walked to the microphone that had been set up in the center aisle. "Good evening. My name is Xavier Irons, and I live at 4782 Sagaro Lane. I received a violation notice last week regarding what was described as unauthorized heating equipment. I am here to explain that the items in question are actually medical equipment prescribed by my rheumatologist for managing severe arthritis." I opened my folder and pulled out Dr. Chen's letter. "I have documentation here explaining the medical necessity of these heated floor mats. They allow me to work in my garage without experiencing debilitating pain. Under the Fair Housing Act, HOAs are required to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. I am requesting that accommodation tonight." Patricia did not even look at the papers I was holding up. "Mr. Irons, we have discussed your situation. The board has decided that community guidelines apply equally to all residents, regardless of circumstance. The items in question are visible from the street and violate our appearance standards. There are plenty of other ways you can manage your medical condition that do not involve violating community rules." "Such as?" I asked, feeling my frustration rising. "That is not the board's concern. You could store the items in a closet when not in use, or perhaps cover your garage window." "We are not medical professionals, Mr. Irons. We are here to maintain community standards. But these are medical devices. I need them to be able to function in my own garage. Surely the board can make an exception for legitimate medical equipment." The treasurer leaned forward. "Mr. Irons, if we make an exception for you, where does it end? Next thing you know, everyone will want exceptions. The rules exist for a reason." I felt my face getting hot. This is not about making exceptions for everyone. This is about complying with federal disability law. The Fair Housing Act specifically requires reasonable accommodations. Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Irons, I suggest you consult with an attorney if you feel your rights are being violated. This board has made its decision. Your violation stands, and if the items are not removed from view by Friday at 5 p.m., you will begin accruing fines at $200 per day. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the board?" I stood there for a moment, speechless. She had just completely dismissed everything I had said. Behind me, another resident stood up to complain about a neighbor's tree branches, and I realized I had been categorically shut down. I walked back to my seat, collected my things, and left the meeting while the board discussed tree trimming regulations. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. My hands were throbbing, my knees ached, and I kept replaying the meeting in my head. Patricia Vanderbilt had not just dismissed my concerns, she had dismissed my disability. She had treated my medical needs as an inconvenience, something I could just work around to comply with her aesthetic standards. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Ellen Richardson, and she specialized in HOA disputes and disability rights. Her office was in Tempe, about a 30-minute drive from my house. She agreed to see me that afternoon. Ellen Richardson was probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her office was small but professional, with law books lining one wall and framed degrees on another. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. "You have all the documentation with you?" she asked when I finished. I handed over my folder. She spent several minutes reading through Dr. Chen's letter, the violation notice, and the email exchange with Patricia. "Okay," she said finally. "This is pretty straightforward. The HOA is violating the Fair Housing Act. They are required to provide reasonable accommodations for disabilities, and heated floor mats that allow you to use your garage are about as reasonable as it gets. The fact that they are visible through a window is irrelevant. So what do we do? First, I am going to send them a formal letter explaining the law and demanding they rescind the violation. I will also request that they update their policies to comply with federal disability requirements. If they refuse, we can file a complaint with HUD or pursue legal action. Most HOAs back down once they realize they are violating federal law and facing potential liability. How much is this going to cost me?" Ellen smiled. "My initial consultation is free. If they back down after the letter, I charge $500. If we have to pursue further action, we can discuss fees, but many disability discrimination cases can result in the other party paying your attorney fees if you prevail. So there is a chance I might not have to pay anything. If we end up in court or arbitration and win, yes. But let us start with the letter and see what happens. Most board presidents like Patricia are bullies who fold when someone actually stands up to them with legal backing." I left Ellen's office feeling better than I had in days. Finally, someone was taking my situation seriously. Finally, I had someone on my side who understood both the law and how to deal with unreasonable HOA boards. Ellen sent her letter via certified mail the next day. According to the tracking information, Patricia Vanderbilt signed for it on Friday morning at 10:15. My violation deadline was that same day at 5 p.m. I spent the day working in my garage, standing on my heated mats, waiting to see what would happen. At 4:30, my phone rang. It was Patricia Vanderbilt. "Mr. Irons, I received a letter from your attorney today." "Yes, I hired legal counsel to address the situation." "I see. Well, I want you to know that threatening the board with legal action is not the way we do things in this community. We prefer to resolve issues amicably." "I tried to resolve this amicably," I said, keeping my voice level. "I provided medical documentation. I explained the situation. I attended a board meeting. You dismissed everything I said and threatened me with $200 daily fines. We were simply enforcing community rules. You were violating federal disability law." There was a long pause. "The board will need to discuss this matter further. I am extending your deadline by 1 week while we consult with our attorney." "That is fine. I will inform my attorney." She hung up without saying goodbye. I immediately called Ellen and told her about the conversation. "Good," she said. "They are scared. Their attorney probably read my letter and told them they are screwed. This should be over soon." But Ellen underestimated Patricia Vanderbilt's stubbornness. Over the next week, I received no communication from the HOA. The extended deadline came and went. Finally, 10 days after Ellen sent her initial letter, I received a response via certified mail. The letter was from the HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Foster. It was 3 pages of legal jargon that essentially argued that the Fair Housing Act did not apply because my heated mats were not a necessary accommodation. The letter claimed that there were alternative ways I could manage my condition without violating community appearance standards, and therefore the HOA was not required to make any accommodation. The letter concluded by stating that the violation stood and that fines would begin accruing immediately at $200 per day. I called Ellen immediately. She sounded angry when I read her the letter over the phone. "That is absolute nonsense," she said. "They do not get to decide what accommodations are necessary. That is determined by medical professionals. Give me a day to draft a response." Ellen's response was swift and brutal. She sent a 5-page letter citing case law, federal regulations, and specific instances where HOAs had been found liable for exactly this kind of violation. She also included a calculation showing that, if this went to court, the HOA could be liable not just for my attorney fees but also for damages, civil penalties, and potential punitive damages. She concluded by giving them 72 hours to rescind the violation or face a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This time, the response came even faster. 2 days later, I received a call from Gerald Foster himself. "Mr. Irons, this is Gerald Foster, attorney for the Desert Valley Estates HOA. I have been discussing your situation with the board and we would like to propose a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" "The board is willing to rescind the violation if you agree to install frosted window film on your garage window so that the mats are not visible from the street. The HOA will even pay for the film installation." I thought about it. It was not a perfect solution, but it was reasonable. "And the violation will be completely removed from my record. No fines." "Correct. The violation will be rescinded as if it never happened. And this will not happen again. I can continue using my medical equipment without harassment." The board has agreed to add a provision to the community guidelines specifically allowing for reasonable accommodations for medical equipment. I need to discuss this with my attorney, but it sounds acceptable. I called Ellen and explained the offer. She was quiet for a moment. "It is your decision, Xavier. This is a reasonable accommodation. They are backing down, which is what we wanted. However, you should know that if we pursue this further, you might be able to get more. You could potentially recover damages for the stress and harassment." "I just want to live in peace," I said. "If they are willing to back down and change their policies, that is enough for me." "Okay, I will draft an agreement making sure everything is in writing. Do not accept anything until I review it." The agreement arrived 3 days later. Ellen reviewed it, made a few minor changes, and I signed it. The HOA board signed it the next day. A professional window film installer showed up at my house 2 days after that and applied frosted film to my garage window. The entire thing cost the HOA $350, plus whatever they had paid Gerald Foster for his legal advice. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks after the agreement was signed, I came home from a grocery run to find Patricia Vanderbilt standing in my driveway. She was talking to my neighbor, a friendly retired teacher named Margaret Hayes. As I pulled into my garage, I saw Patricia point at my house and shake her head. Margaret looked uncomfortable. I got out of my car and started unloading groceries. Patricia walked over. "Mr. Irons, I wanted to inform you that the board will be conducting a full inspection of your property next week." "An inspection? For what?" "Routine compliance check. We do them periodically to ensure all residents are following community guidelines." "This is the first I am hearing of routine inspections." "They are in the guidelines. Section 22.7. I knew Section 22.7. It allowed for inspections, but they were supposed to be announced 30 days in advance and only conducted twice a year for the entire community, not targeting individual residents. When was the last community-wide inspection? Patricia's jaw tightened. That is not relevant. Your property will be inspected next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Please ensure we have access to all exterior areas, including your backyard and side yards. She walked away before I could respond. Margaret Hayes caught my eye and gave me an apologetic shrug. That evening, I called Ellen again. She is retaliating, Ellen said immediately. This is classic HOA harassment. They cannot get you on the mats, so now they are going to inspect every inch of your property looking for violations. Is that legal? It depends. If they are conducting inspections of other properties too, it is legal. If they are specifically targeting you, it is retaliation, which is illegal. Do you have a good relationship with any of your neighbors? I am friendly with a few people. Margaret next door, Tom across the street, a couple others. Call them. Ask if they have received inspection notices. If you are the only one, we have a problem. I spent the next hour making calls. None of my neighbors had received inspection notices. Tom Chen, who lived across the street and had some bushes that were probably 6 inches over the approved height, had not heard anything. The Johnsons 2 doors down, who had a basketball hoop in their driveway that was technically a violation, had not been contacted. I was the only one being inspected. Ellen drafted another letter. This one accused the HOA of retaliation and harassment. She pointed out that selective enforcement of rules was itself a violation of the HOA's duty to treat all residents fairly. She demanded that the inspection be canceled unless it was part of a genuine community-wide compliance check. Patricia Vanderbilt responded with a voicemail. "Mr. Irons, the inspection will proceed as scheduled. If you refuse access, you will be in violation of Section 22.7 and subject to fines. I suggest you cooperate." On Wednesday morning at exactly 10 a.m., Patricia showed up at my door with 2 other board members and a clipboard. I let them in because Ellen had advised me that refusing access would give them legitimate grounds for a violation. They spent 90 minutes going over my property with a level of scrutiny that would make a military inspector proud. They measured the height of my shrubs, checked the color of my exterior paint against approved samples, examined my roof tiles for damage, and walked every inch of my yard looking for violations. Through it all, Patricia made notes on her clipboard while the other board members awkwardly followed her around. In the end, they found 3 violations. First, my front yard grass was 1 inch longer than the approved maximum height of 3 inches. Second, I had a small oil stain on my driveway that violated the maintenance standards. Third, one of my exterior light fixtures was a slightly different shade of bronze than the approved color. I received the violation notices that afternoon via email. Each violation came with a 10-day correction period followed by fines of $50 per day if not corrected. The cost to fix everything would be minimal, but that was not the point. The point was harassment. The point was Patricia Vanderbilt using her authority as HOA president to punish me for standing up to her. I forwarded the violations to Ellen immediately. She called me within an hour. We need to file a formal complaint. This is textbook retaliation. The problem is that each individual violation might be technically valid, even if the selective enforcement is not. We need to document everything and build a pattern. How do we do that? Start taking pictures of your neighbor's properties. Document any violations you see that the HOA is not enforcing. Keep records of all communication with Patricia and the board. If she continues this pattern of harassment, we will have grounds for a much bigger case. Over the next week, I became an amateur property inspector. I walked the neighborhood with my phone, photographing tall grass, oil stains, paint issues, and maintenance problems. It was not hard to find violations. Nearly every property had something that technically violated the extensive community guidelines. The difference was that nobody else was being cited for these minor issues. I mowed my lawn, cleaned my driveway with industrial degreaser, and ordered a new light fixture in the exact approved shade of bronze. I documented all of these expenses and submitted the receipts to Ellen. By the time my 10-day correction period ended, I had spent $340 fixing violations that most of my neighbors also had, but were not being forced to correct. Then things escalated. 2 weeks after the inspection, I received a notice that the HOA board had voted to increase my monthly fees by $75. The notice stated that because my property required additional monitoring and enforcement resources, I was being assessed a special administrative fee. The increase was effective immediately. I read the notice 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. They were charging me extra money because they were harassing me. It was like being charged for the cost of your own persecution. Ellen's response was immediate and forceful. She filed a formal complaint with HUD alleging disability discrimination and retaliation. She also filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA licensing in the state. Finally, she sent a letter to Patricia Vanderbilt and the board threatening a federal lawsuit if the special fee was not rescinded immediately. This time, the HOA did not back down. Gerald Foster sent a letter defending the special fee and arguing that it was a legitimate response to the increased administrative burden I had caused by hiring an attorney and refusing to cooperate with reasonable requests. The letter made no mention of the disability discrimination or Fair Housing Act violations. They are digging themselves in deeper, Ellen told me over the phone. This is actually good for us, legally speaking. Every action they take creates more evidence of discrimination and retaliation. But I know it does not feel good for you right now. She was right. It did not feel good. It felt like being under siege in my own home. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I wondered what Patricia would find wrong next. I stopped using my garage for anything other than parking my car because I did not want to give her ammunition. I let my grass sit for days after it needed mowing because I did not want it too short either. I was walking on eggshells in my own home. Then Patricia made her biggest mistake. One morning in late September, I went to my car to run errands and found a boot on my front passenger wheel. A bright yellow metal boot with a lock and a notice attached. The notice stated that my vehicle registration had expired, and that parking an unregistered vehicle in the community violated Section 15.3 of the guidelines. The notice said I had 24 hours to renew my registration, and pay a $300 boot removal fee, or my car would be towed at my expense. The problem was that my registration was not expired. It was not due for renewal until December. I checked twice, pulling out my registration from the glove box and verifying the date. December 15, 2025, 3 months away. I took photos of everything: the boot, the notice, my registration. Then I called the number on the boot notice. It rang through to a local booting company called Fast Lock Towing and Vehicle Immobilization. A man answered on the third ring. "Yeah, Fast Lock. Hi, my name is Xavier Irons. You put a boot on my car this morning, but my registration is not expired. Address: 4782 Saguaro Lane, Desert Valley Estates." I heard typing. "Says here the HOA reported your vehicle as unregistered. We just do what they contract us to do. Can you remove the boot? My registration is current. Not without payment or authorization from the HOA. You need to take it up with them." I called Ellen next. When I told her what happened, she was silent for a long moment. "They booted your car based on false information." "Yes, my registration is good until December." "Okay, this just became a much bigger problem for them. That is potentially illegal detention of property, false pretenses, and possibly even fraud. Take pictures of everything and email them to me. Then call the Scottsdale Police non-emergency line and report it." "The police?" "Yes. Someone immobilized your vehicle based on false information." "That is potentially a crime. At the very least, you need a police report documenting what happened." I called the Scottsdale Police Department and explained the situation. They sent an officer out within an hour. His name was Officer Marcus Webb, a younger guy who looked like he spent a lot of time in the gym. He examined the boot, looked at my registration, and took notes. "So your HOA called a boot company and gave them false information about your vehicle registration?" he asked. "That is what it looks like. My registration is clearly current." "You have any documentation that the HOA authorized this?" I showed him the notice attached to the boot, which referenced the HOA's authorization. He took photos of everything. "I am going to write this up as a report. You might want to contact a lawyer because this could be grounds for a civil suit. As for the boot itself, technically, they are supposed to release it immediately once you show proof of current registration. But if they are refusing, that is between you and them or you and your lawyer. I cannot force them to remove it. So I am just stuck. You could call your own towing company to have the vehicle moved with the boot still on it, then deal with removing the boot later. Or you can wait for the company or the HOA to agree to remove it. Unfortunately, boot companies operate in a gray area legally. As long as they are contracted by a property owner or HOA, they have pretty wide latitude. After Officer Webb left, I called Ellen back and told her what he had said. "Okay, here is what we are going to do," she said. "I am going to call Fast Lock directly and threaten them with legal action if they do not remove that boot immediately. If your registration is current, they have no legal basis to immobilize your vehicle, HOA authorization or not. Then I am going to send an emergency demand letter to Patricia and the board. This has crossed a line." Ellen must have put the fear of God into Fast Lock Towing, because an hour later, a different guy showed up and removed the boot without charging me anything. He mumbled something about a miscommunication and refused to answer any of my questions. Ellen's letter to the HOA was the most aggressive yet. She laid out every action Patricia and the board had taken: the initial refusal to accommodate my disability, the retaliatory inspection, the selective enforcement of violations, the special fee, and now the false vehicle boot. She characterized the pattern as systematic harassment and discrimination. She demanded that the HOA immediately cease all enforcement actions against me, rescind all fines and fees, issue a formal apology, and pay $10,000 in damages for emotional distress. If they refused, she would file a federal lawsuit within 7 days. The response came not from Gerald Foster, but from someone new. Her name was Diane Morrison, and she identified herself as a mediator hired by the HOA's insurance company. Apparently, once Ellen had threatened a federal lawsuit and filed complaints with HUD and the state, the HOA's insurance carrier had gotten involved. Insurance companies do not like potentially expensive litigation, and they tend to force common sense on their clients. Diane called me directly. "Mr. Irons, I have been hired by the Desert Valley Estates HOA's insurance carrier to facilitate a resolution to this dispute. I have reviewed all the documentation from both sides, and I believe we can reach an agreement that satisfies everyone. I am listening. First, the HOA agrees to rescind all violations, fees, and fines assessed against you. Second, they will issue a formal written apology. Third, they agree to pay $5,000 to compensate you for your expenses and inconvenience. Fourth, the board will undergo training on Fair Housing Act compliance. Finally, Patricia Vanderbilt will be asked to resign as board president." I was stunned. Patricia is resigning. The insurance company feels that her continued leadership creates too much liability for the association. The other board members have agreed that her resignation is in the best interest of the community. What about my attorney fees? The HOA will pay up to $10,000 in attorney fees with receipts. Does that sound acceptable? I told her I needed to discuss it with Ellen. When I called Ellen and told her about the offer, she sounded satisfied. "That is a good settlement, Xavier. You are being made whole financially, Patricia is being removed, and the HOA has to undergo training so this does not happen to someone else. I think you should take it." "What about the fact that she falsely reported my vehicle? Isn't that a crime? Potentially, but proving criminal intent is difficult. The police report documents what happened, which could be useful if you wanted to pursue a separate civil action against Patricia personally. But that would be a long, expensive process. Sometimes you have to accept a good resolution when it is offered." I thought about it for a day. Part of me wanted to see Patricia face actual consequences, not just being asked to step down from her little kingdom. But the other part of me was exhausted. I had spent months dealing with this situation, and it had taken a toll on my health and peace of mind. I just wanted it to be over. I accepted the settlement. The paperwork was signed within a week. The HOA issued a formal letter of apology, rescinded all violations and fees, and cut me a check for $5,000. They paid Ellen's invoice for $8,300 in attorney fees. Patricia Vanderbilt resigned at the next board meeting. I did not attend that meeting, but Margaret Hayes did. She called me afterward to tell me what happened. "She threw a fit," Margaret said, barely containing her laughter. She said she had been unfairly targeted, that she was just trying to maintain community standards, and that the board was betraying everything she had worked for. Then she literally threw her planner at the treasurer and stormed out. Wow. The whole room just sat there in silence for a minute. Then Dorothy Winters, the secretary, said maybe it was time for some changes around here. They appointed Tom Chen as interim president until the next election. Tom Chen, my neighbor from across the street, called me the next day. "Hey Xavier, I just wanted to let you know that as interim president, one of my first acts is going to be proposing we revise our community guidelines to specifically include provisions for reasonable accommodations. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. I appreciate that, Tom. And listen, I am sorry you had to go through all this. A lot of us in the neighborhood knew Patricia was out of control, but nobody wanted to stand up to her. You did, and I respect that. Life slowly returned to normal. I went back to using my heated floor mats without fear. I worked on projects in my garage. I let my grass grow to a comfortable 3¼ inches without worrying about violation notices. The new HOA board under Tom's leadership was reasonable and responsive. They actually served the community instead of ruling over it. About 2 months after the settlement, I ran into Patricia Vanderbilt at a grocery store in Scottsdale. She was in the produce section, inspecting apples with the same critical eye she had once used to inspect my property. Our eyes met for a moment. I expected her to say something, to make some cutting remark, or offer some justification for her behavior. Instead, she just turned away and walked to a different aisle. I realized then that she probably still thought she had been right. People like Patricia do not reflect on their behavior and have moments of growth. They just move on to the next place where they can exercise power over others, convinced of their own righteousness. I felt a moment of pity for her, followed by gratitude that she was no longer my problem. Ellen called me a few weeks later with an update. The HUD complaint I had filed had resulted in a formal investigation of the Desert Valley Estates, HOA. They were found to have violated the Fair Housing Act and were required to implement a comprehensive compliance program, including regular training for all board members and a formal process for residents to request reasonable accommodations. Additionally, the HOA had to pay a civil penalty to HUD of $5,000. So something good came out of all this, Ellen said. Not just for you, but for everyone in that community and potentially other communities. When HOAs get sanctioned by HUD, it sends a message. The Arizona Department of Real Estate also took action, placing the Desert Valley Estates HOA on a watch list and requiring additional oversight and reporting for the next 2 years. If they had any additional violations during that period, they would face more serious consequences. As for the incident with the boot on my car, I did consider pursuing action against Patricia personally. Ellen looked into it and found that proving she had intentionally provided false information would be difficult. The boot company had no record of who specifically had called them, and Patricia could claim it was an honest mistake or that someone else on the board had made the call. Without clear evidence of her personal involvement and intent, a civil case would be expensive and uncertain. I decided to let it go. Spring came to Arizona, bringing with it temperatures that make most people question why humans choose to live in a desert. My arthritis actually improved somewhat with the consistent heat, though I still relied on my heated mats when working in the garage during the cooler morning hours. The community slowly changed under Tom Chen's leadership. The new board approved several modifications to the guidelines, making them more reasonable and less focused on aesthetic perfection. They instituted a formal appeals process for violations, ensuring that residents had a way to challenge decisions without having to hire attorneys. They also created a specific accommodation request process for residents with disabilities or medical conditions, with clear timelines and standards for approval. I became more involved in the community, attending HOA meetings regularly, and even joining the Architectural Review Committee. It turned out that my engineering background was useful for evaluating modification requests and helping neighbors navigate the approval process. It felt good to be part of a solution rather than a victim of a problem. One evening in May, about 8 months after the whole situation began, I was in my garage working on a model train layout I had started building. I was standing on my heated mats, carefully soldering tiny wires to track switches when my phone rang. It was Margaret Hayes. "Xavier, are you watching the local news?" "No, I am in the garage." "Why?" "Turn on Channel 12. There is a story about HOAs and disability discrimination. They are featuring your case." I went inside and turned on the television. Sure enough, there was a news segment about HOA overreach and disability rights. They did not use my name, but they detailed a case that was clearly mine. An HOA demanding removal of medical equipment, refusing to accommodate a disability, and ultimately facing sanctions from federal regulators. The segment included an interview with a fair housing advocate who talked about how common these situations were and how many people do not know their rights. "Cases like this are unfortunately common," the advocate said. "HOAs often overstep their authority, and residents do not realize that federal disability law supersedes HOA rules. If you have a legitimate medical need for equipment or modifications, the HOA is required to accommodate you. They do not get to decide what is medically necessary. That is between you and your doctor." The segment concluded with tips for residents dealing with similar situations and information about where to file complaints if their rights were being violated. I watched the whole thing with a strange mixture of embarrassment and satisfaction. Embarrassment because my situation was being broadcast to thousands of people, but satisfaction because maybe someone else would see it and stand up for their own rights. Margaret called back as soon as the segment ended. "Well, you are famous now." "I guess so. I am just glad my name was not mentioned. I think it is good that the story got out there. People need to know that HOAs cannot just do whatever they want." She was right, of course. For too long, HOAs had operated with minimal oversight, wielding enormous power over people's homes and lives with little accountability. The more these stories got public attention, the more likely it was that something would change systemically. A few days after the news segment aired, I received a letter from a woman in Chandler, about 40 minutes away. Her name was Linda, and she was dealing with a similar situation. Her HOA was trying to make her remove a wheelchair ramp that her disabled son needed to access their home. The HOA claimed the ramp was not aesthetically consistent with the community's appearance standards. Linda had seen the news segment and tracked me down through the local arthritis support group I had joined. I called her immediately and gave her Ellen Richardson's contact information. I also walked her through everything I had learned about the Fair Housing Act, reasonable accommodations, and how to document everything. A month later, Linda called to thank me. Her HOA had backed down after receiving a letter from Ellen, and the ramp was staying. Her son could now access his own home safely and independently. That started a pattern. Over the next few months, I heard from several other people dealing with unreasonable HOA demands. Some were disability-related, others were just cases of overreach and petty tyranny. I could not help everyone, but I could share what I had learned and connect people with resources. Ellen actually started getting regular referrals from people I had helped, and she joked that I should get a finder's fee. By the time summer arrived, life had found a comfortable rhythm. My arthritis was well managed. My home was my own again. The community was being run by reasonable people who actually cared about residents rather than just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcement. I had even started dating someone I met at a local community center, a retired librarian named Janet who thought my HOA battle stories were hilarious. One Saturday morning in July, I was having coffee on my back patio when Tom Chen knocked on my side gate. "Hey Xavier, got a minute?" "Sure, come on back." Tom pulled up a chair and accepted the coffee I offered. "So the board met last night and we wanted to run something by you. We are thinking about creating a community ombudsman position. Someone who residents can come to if they have issues with HOA decisions or feel like they are being treated unfairly. Kind of a buffer between the board and residents. We were wondering if you would be interested." "Really? After everything that happened?" "Especially after everything that happened. You know what it is like to be on the other side of an unreasonable HOA. You have educated yourself about the laws and resident rights, and you have shown you are willing to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. That is exactly what we need." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to just live quietly and avoid any further HOA drama. But another part of me remembered how alone I had felt when Patricia was coming after me, how desperate I had been for someone in the community to stand up and say what was happening was wrong. "Okay," I said. "I will do it, but I want clear guidelines about the role and the authority it has. I do not want to be a figurehead." "Absolutely. We will work it out properly. This is about actually helping people, not creating another layer of bureaucracy." The ombudsman position was formalized at the next HOA meeting. It was a volunteer role with the authority to review violations, attend board meetings, and advocate for residents who felt they were being treated unfairly. The board could not override my recommendations, but they had to formally consider them and provide written explanations if they chose to proceed against my advice. It was not perfect, but it was a significant check on potential abuse of power. My first case as ombudsman came 2 weeks later. A young couple had received a violation notice for having a vegetable garden in their front yard. The guidelines technically prohibited front yard gardens, but the couple argued that their backyard was completely shaded and vegetables needed sun. They were not being unreasonable or trying to create an eyesore. They had built neat raised beds and were growing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. I reviewed the guidelines, visited their property, and met with them to understand their situation. Then I wrote a recommendation to the board suggesting they create an exception for neat, well-maintained vegetable gardens in raised beds. I pointed out that many communities were moving toward allowing edible landscaping as both environmentally friendly and cost-effective for residents. The board voted 4-1 to accept my recommendation and modify the guidelines. The couple got to keep their garden, and other residents could now do the same. It felt good to be part of making the community more livable rather than more restrictive. As fall approached, and the oppressive Arizona heat finally began to ease, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year. What had started as a simple violation notice over my heated floor mats had turned into a months-long battle, a federal complaint, news coverage, and ultimately significant changes to how our HOA operated. I had spent thousands of dollars and countless hours fighting something that should never have been a fight in the first place, but I had won. Not just for myself, but for everyone else in the community who might need an accommodation or face an unreasonable board in the future. The system was better because I had refused to back down. That mattered. Patricia Vanderbilt moved out of Desert Valley Estates in October. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had bought a house in a different community in North Scottsdale. I felt sorry for her new neighbors, but mostly I just felt relieved. Her chapter in my life was closed. On a cool November evening, I was in my garage working on a small wooden jewelry box I was making as a gift for Janet. I was standing on my heated floor mats, my arthritic hands carefully sanding the edges smooth, when I realized how content I felt. My home was truly my home. I could use the medical equipment I needed without fear. The community I lived in was reasonable and fair. I had friends, a girlfriend, and a sense of purpose through my role as ombudsman. The heated floor mats that had caused so much trouble were just doing their job, keeping my joints warm and functional so I could do the things I enjoyed. They were not unsightly violations or threats to property values. They were medical devices that allowed a man with arthritis to live independently and pursue his hobbies. It should have been that simple from the beginning. But sometimes you have to fight for simple things. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies with clipboards and cite federal law to people who think their aesthetic preferences matter more than your medical needs. Sometimes you have to spend money you should not have to spend and time you should not have to waste just to protect your basic rights. And sometimes, if you are lucky, fighting that fight leads to changes that help other people. It creates ripples that spread outward, making things better for people you will never meet. That is what made it worth it in the end. I finished sanding the jewelry box, blew off the dust, and stepped back to admire my work. My hands ached a bit, but not too badly. The heated mats had done their job. Tomorrow I would stain the wood and start on the brass hinges. For now, though, I was content to just stand in my garage in my home, using my medical equipment without fear or harassment. That, ultimately, was all I had ever wanted. It was what everyone deserved. And thanks to one stubborn retired engineer who refused to back down, it was what the residents of Desert Valley Estates now had. The holidays came and went peacefully. The new HOA board approved reasonable decorations without the petty restrictions Patricia had enforced. No one measured the exact height of inflatable snowmen or counted the number of lights on houses. The community looked festive and welcoming rather than rigidly uniform. In January, I attended a regional HOA conference that Tom had told me about. It was held in Phoenix and focused on best practices for community associations. I went mostly out of curiosity, but also because I wanted to learn more about my role as ombudsman and how other communities handled resident disputes. The conference was full of board members, property managers, and HOA attorneys. During a lunch break, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Sarah who served on an HOA board in Tucson. When I mentioned my experience, her eyes widened. "Wait, you are the heated floor mat guy." That case has been used as an example in like 3 different seminars here. You basically created a roadmap for how HOAs should handle disability accommodation requests. I was surprised. Really? Yeah, your attorney's letters and the HUD complaint are being used as training materials. A lot of HOAs are updating their policies because of what happened to you. You made a real impact. It was strange to think that my personal nightmare had become a teaching tool. But if it meant fewer people would have to go through what I went through, then maybe all the stress and frustration had served a larger purpose. When I returned home, I found Ellen Richardson had sent me an email. She wanted me to know that she had been contacted by a legal publisher about writing an article on HOA disability discrimination for a property law journal. She wanted to use my case as the primary example and asked if I would be willing to be interviewed. I agreed. Over the next few weeks, I spoke with Ellen several times, providing details and documentation. The article was published in March, and she sent me a copy. Reading about my experience in formal legal language was surreal, but the conclusion of the article resonated with me. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining community standards and property values, Ellen had written. However, they must operate within the bounds of federal, state, and local law. When an HOA prioritizes aesthetic preferences over federal disability protections, They not only violate the law but also betray the fundamental purpose of community associations: to serve the residents. The case of Irons v. Desert Valley Estates, HOA, demonstrates both the vulnerability of residents facing discrimination and the power of informed advocacy to correct injustice. Spring arrived again, marking a full year since the settlement. The Desert Valley Estates, HOA, had fully transformed under new leadership. They had launched a community garden, started a neighborhood watch program, and even organized monthly social events. The focus had shifted from enforcement to community building, and the difference was palpable. I continued my work as ombudsman, handling several cases throughout the year. Most were simple misunderstandings that could be resolved with communication. A few required me to push back against board decisions that overstepped reasonable bounds. In every case, I thought about how I had felt when Patricia was targeting me, and I made sure no one else had to feel that way. One case particularly stood out. An elderly veteran named Frank had received a violation for having a flagpole that exceeded the approved height by 2 feet. He had installed it to fly the American flag, and it had sentimental value because his son had given it to him before deploying overseas. The board wanted him to cut it down or remove it. I researched the issue and discovered the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, a federal law that limits HOA restrictions on flag display. I presented this information to the board and recommended they rescind the violation. They agreed, and Frank got to keep his flagpole. He showed up at my door the next day with tears in his eyes to thank me. These moments made everything I had been through worthwhile. Every person I helped was validation that standing up to Patricia Vanderbilt had been the right choice. Every policy change and every reasonable decision by the new board was proof that communities could function without petty tyranny. By summer, I had settled into a comfortable routine. My arthritis was stable, managed with a combination of medication, physical therapy, and yes, my heated floor mats when needed. Janet and I had grown closer, and she had become a regular fixture in my life. We took trips around Arizona, exploring small towns and hiking trails that accommodated my physical limitations. Life was good. Then, one afternoon in August, I received an unexpected phone call. The person on the other end identified himself as Marcus Webb, the police officer who had taken the report about my booted car over a year ago. "Mr. Irons, I am calling because something has come up that you might want to know about. Patricia Vanderbilt has been arrested." I was stunned. "Arrested? For what?" "She moved into a new community after leaving yours, and apparently she was elected HOA president there too. But this time she went too far. She was charged with trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. Apparently she entered a resident's property without permission and removed some items she deemed violations. The resident had security cameras and caught the whole thing. When we investigated, we found a pattern of similar behavior toward multiple residents." Wow. I guess she did not learn anything. No, she did not. The reason I am calling is that the prosecutor wants to establish a pattern of behavior. Your case came up because of the police report from the boot incident. They might want to talk to you about what happened. I am happy to help if needed. I will pass that along. I just thought you would want to know that she finally faced consequences. After Officer Webb hung up, I sat for a long time processing the information. Part of me felt vindicated. Patricia had continued her behavior and finally been held accountable in a way that actually mattered. But another part of me just felt sad. She had so much power and authority to do good in her communities, and instead, she had used it to make people's lives miserable. What a waste. I never heard from the prosecutor, which suggested they had enough evidence without my testimony. But I followed the case in the local news. Patricia Vanderbilt pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges of criminal trespassing and criminal damage. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and ordered to pay restitution to the residents she had harmed. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. It was not a dramatic ending, no prison time or major scandal, but it was justice of a sort. Patricia could no longer use HOA authority to harass anyone. That mattered. As I approached the 2-year anniversary of moving to Desert Valley Estates, I looked back on everything that had happened with a sense of perspective I had not had while living through it. Yes, the experience with Patricia Vanderbilt had been terrible. Yes, it had cost me time, money, and peace of mind. But it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and the importance of community. More importantly, it had led to positive changes that benefited many people beyond myself. The HOA had better policies, better leadership, and a better culture. Other communities were learning from what had happened. People with disabilities had a clearer understanding of their rights. And I had found a sense of purpose in helping others navigate similar situations. On a cool October evening, I stood in my garage one last time, reflecting on the journey that had started with a simple orange violation notice. My heated floor mats sat on the concrete floor, just medical equipment doing their job. No drama, no violations, no harassment. Just tools that helped a man with arthritis live his life. Janet called from inside the house, asking if I wanted to go out for dinner. I took one last look around my garage, my space, my home, and smiled. Everything I had fought for had been worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone who would benefit from the changes that had rippled outward from one stubborn man who refused to let an HOA Karen take away his medical equipment. I turned off the garage light and went inside, ready for dinner and whatever came next, knowing that my home was truly my home and that no HOA board would ever take that away from me again.